What's up, y'all? I'm KM Best, and I have been playing a bunch of different decks in Conquest mode to figure out what is viable in the new meta. 4 of them have been more successful than the others, so I would like to talk about those 4 decks here. Consider this a little bit of an abbreviated tier list, an early tier list. These are not necessarily all things that I will throw my weight behind a week from now, but they are decks that I have been playing right now to great success. Obviously, as the meta shapes up, I'd be interested to see what changes. So let's take a look. This is the shell that I am the absolute most confident in. Like, if this deck was still around in like a week, a month, I would be totally unsurprised. And this is just the W Thanos shell. The goal here is to scam people with Professor X early in the game. Now, the basic thing we're trying to do is play 5-cost cards on turn 4. The reason we want to do this is because we are so able to fill up our early turns with stones and our late turns with scams that it's very hard to actually get cards down against this deck. It is quite powerful. I also added a magic into the deck. I replaced Cosmo with it because I didn't find a lot of value in Cosmo given how clogged my late turns were. Magic is mostly there to give us an additional scam angle because Thanos has Reality Stone, a Scarlet Witch effect built into the deck. So right now what I'm doing is I'm playing Magic in there, and my opponent has to guess the entire time if I'm going to blow up the Magic or not. And that just creates more and more confusion in these situations. In addition, it gives you more time to draw to your specific outs in various spots if you actually want the game to go to a turn 7. There's a lot of times where you need like a Jeff off the top and you want to play like a Jeff and a Blue Marvel to steal a lane that doesn't look like you should be able to steal. And that turn 7 allows you to do that. So this is the place that I've found her to be the most useful. That said, I don't really think you need her per se. And another card that I'm not sure you need right now is Luke Cage. I'd be interested in finding other cheap cards to play in those spots, but the most important thing about those 2 spots is the card has to be either cheap or Chavez, right? Because we need to be able to deploy our stuff early. Getting stuff on the board early is the most important thing you can do with this deck, and I generally think that you don't want to be adding much more heavy stuff or even like 3s or 4s into this deck if you can avoid it. Next up is a totally unchanged deck, and frankly, this one felt like the absolute strongest thing that I played. Nothing even felt particularly close. It felt like I had answers to everything. I could deal with everything. I was consistently putting out a bunch of my own points. It was hard to know where my opponents were supposed to even go if they wanted to beat me. And this is the typical Patriot deck where Invisible Woman does double duty, both hiding your Patriot and, of course, protecting your Killmonger and Shang-Chi so that they always go off at the end of the game so that you get a lot more value out of them. That said, if you run into the Thanos decks, don't get tunnel visioned on protecting your Killmonger because they run Professor X. You're going to want to be blowing up their stuff as much as you can around turn 3. So if the Thanos deck has priority against you, playing a bunch of stones, fire that Killmonger off. He is quite powerful in those situations. You don't want to let them get a free Professor X down. You want to make their Professor X as hard as possible to play. Now, this deck does not go super high, incredible, over the top anymore. It's just pretty good. And there are other builds of the deck that can go super high, incredible, over the top. But what that means is you need to be aware of like potential weaknesses to decks that do go super high, incredible, over the top. Negative decks are kind of back, and they are not the greatest matchup for you unless you can just sort of maximize when you are doing the thing and minimize when they are. You really have to respect them when they are playing early Mr. Negatives, especially with Magic around now. You really do sort of feel like a little bit of a dog in that matchup unless you were out snapping them. And I think that is the main pitch here, because it's very hard for this deck to be truly unfavored if you know what you're doing just a little bit better than they do. If you are able to juice some cubes in matchups that you maybe shouldn't be able to, you're just so consistent across the board. It's very hard to deal with what this deck does because it's very good at dealing with what your opponents do. It's a very good mid-range curve-out deck that interacts and also proactively just puts a ton of points down. That's always going to be pretty good. I did want to try something with the most recently changed cards, Kitty Pryde and Hitmonkey. the way I thought about this was, I think we probably need to put Sera back in order to make the Hitmonkey cheaper again. Kitty Pryde is actually not necessarily better than she was in the Sera decks, but you're no longer so punished for taking turn 5 off with Kitty Pryde. And if she's like a 1-4 or a 1-6, that's actually still pretty good, and you're still interested in that. And her downside is actually much higher because she's now a 1-2 at base. You can do a lot of cool stuff with this. So one thing that I did notice was the power of just having reactive cards in early metagames. It's really, really strong, right? There are a lot of people playing like Mr. Negative. You have Enchantress. There are people playing Lockjaw. You have Shang-Chi. And generally right now, people are experimenting with stuff. And the more they experiment with stuff, the more you can sort of be the cops of the format and be like, no. Calm it down here. Now, one thing that you will have to do is customize this deck to your metagame. If you run into stuff like Nimrod and Phoenix Force decks, you're going to need Armor, Cosmo, things like that. You're going to have to take this deck and try to make it customized to you. But I think generally speaking, this deck has some legit legs and is now no longer entirely outclassed by the bounce versions of this deck that just like cut Sera and just like we're running good cards instead. Finally, I am absolutely shocked at my findings here, but discard was really good. The power ceiling of the format feels like it got significantly lower, right? High Evolutionary Hulk is now no longer enormous. Bounce decks are now no longer able to like free roll Bastard Iron Man and put like 20 power in each lane. And if you're looking for a deck that can actually just like put a lot of power in a lot of different lanes, discard does that really well. Now, the number one card you're going to have to pay attention to, whether you have it or not, is MODOK. MODOK is the card for this deck, but luckily, it's a card you need on turn 5. You run America Chavez, you have a very good chance of actually drawing MODOK, but MODOK is the engine of this deck. He is what makes the deck go. I have not been a huge fan of MODOK decks. I mean, especially in the last meta where Spider-Ham was just everywhere, and their counters are obvious. Like, if you run into Spider-Ham, like, we did beat a Spider-Ham gamer, but it wasn't easy, right? Like, it is still a card you don't want to see, but you do have just a lot of ability to put a lot of power on the board. Multiple swarms buffed with Nakia is extremely powerful. Dracula dodging your opponent's Shang-Chi's is extremely powerful. Generally, what this deck wants to do is more straightforward than what several other decks want to do, and you end up playing a less interactive game in the sense of your cards don't directly interact with your opponents, and a more interactive game in the sense of you need to know where to properly allocate your points, and that requires some significant metagame knowledge. So I do think it is a little more complex than it might seem, but also if you're just a beginner, I would encourage you to try this deck, try the Patriot deck. I think there's a lot of simple decks that you can succeed with right now, and this is definitely one of them. It's a good meta for people to try like themed decks in, and that really only happens in like the first week or so before people start figuring out what's actually broken, so enjoy it while you can. I also wanted to highlight some decks that I didn't play, but I did play against that seem like interesting directions for people to investigate. The Phoenix Force, Shuri, Nimrod decks seem very, very strong when they work. I haven't played them enough to know if they work enough, but I'm generally interested in them, although I do think they likely have a pretty poor matchup into like Prof X scam decks. When they don't Prof X you, you know, really good into Spider-Man, right? But if they do Prof X you, it's like, oh. So I'm generally pretty interested in those lists. Magic makes them a little bit better, a little more consistent. I also tried some Silver Surfer, but it felt like right now, if you run into the negative Surfer deck, which is another deck that's probably worth trying, they just end up having your deck but better, and that makes it hard to play a fair deck like Surfer rather than a super unfair one. In terms of Surfer, like, I do think the negative Surfer deck is worth investigating, but I think the better your opponents are, the worse that deck gets, because one of the keys to playing against a negative deck is you need to be snapping when they are not doing their things. You need to be juicing them for cubes when your deck is working and their deck isn't working. And a lot of people don't think about that when they play against a Mr. Negative deck. They think about like what their deck is doing. They don't think about what your deck isn't doing. And so you really have to like understand that if you want to play well against Mr. Negative decks. They're still quite strong, but but I think a lot of the time they get value out of people not quite understanding that they need to punish you and snap aggressively when you are not Mr. Negativing, rather than the alternative. Now, I do like some of the builds that I've seen. They're very, very good when they do what they do. I think it just sort of bears a little bit more investigation. Those decks have certainly been good before, and I am certainly interested to see where they go. That said, as always, I read every comment. Make sure you leave one. I'm leaving that in. Make sure you leave one. I read them all anyway. Thank you so much. As always, I've been Cam Best. I'll see you in the next one.